Part 2. So, sorry about this. The camera only goes for 30 minutes and then it cuts itself out. Someday I'm going to figure out how to edit videos together, or I'm going to get a real camera or something like this. But for now, we just have to put up with this. So, sorry, I got cut off there before. I was talking about phonotactics. So the idea that certain sounds go together in English and certain sounds don't. SL goes together like slow. SR does not go together in English, although it goes together in Cambodia, but not in English. TR goes together in English. DR goes together in English. THR goes together in English, but none of DL, TL, THL does not go together in English. Yeah. So the idea that certain consonants will go together with R, certain consonants go together with L, and certain consonants can go together with either. Like a G can go together with, you can have like both glass and grass. Phonotactics. So my professor said to me, well, here's something you could do that could differentiate yourself from all those other studies. And sure enough, I looked at all the other studies. I didn't look at everything. The searches I did on the search engines I used, I couldn't find any other studies that was testing Japanese learners on phonotactics. There was some studies done with native speakers to see like if they could notice that if you put in train with an L, train instead of train, if they could notice it was an L instead of an R. But there was nothing like that with Japanese speakers. So yeah, that's where, that's why you have an advisor when you write these things, so they can help you with all this stuff. So I said, oh, right. So we kind of snuck that one in there to see if that would get anything useful. The advisor actually had the idea of consonant clusters to kind of, not only the R and the L in light and right, but also kind of grass and glass to kind of sneak that stuff in there. So we did all that, and the test that we designed was, here, let me show it to you. We had two words with a minimal pair. So there would be like light and right, or lice and rice, or lover and rever, or I don't know. Each one was either an L or an R, and we kind of switched them around. So sometimes it would be the L first, sometimes it would be the R first, and sometimes it would be the same. Like sometimes we'd have the L repeated. Again, this is where the advisor was really helpful. She was able to get one of her doctoral students who was trained in phonology to make all the recordings for us very clearly enunciated. Although, yeah, and another kind of practicality thing. We were going over the recording, and she says, right, he's doing a listing intonation. Whereas the first few were good, but then as we got further and further down the list, he started just kind of reading them out like I think the intonation was going up at the end of everyone on the list, which is kind of common when people are reading through a list, even for a trained phonetician. So I think we had to re-record some of them, something like that. And then using sound editing equipment, we just kind of switched them around. So sometimes the L was first, sometimes the R was first, sometimes it was the same word twice. Now the other thing, and this is, I was talking before about the first study ever done on this, Godot in 1971. This is one of his tasks, is to have a same or different task. So there's a question like sometimes Japanese people may have trouble distinguishing what is an L or what is an R, but they can still notice that there are two different sounds. In theory, or sometimes they can't. I think the memory's a bit foggy on this. I think in Godot's case, actually, they had trouble with this. In a lot of the tests, they have trouble not only hearing the sound, but they can't even hear if it's the same or different sound, whether it's two L's or two R's. So you have like right or light, or maybe you have it like light and light, where it's an L both times. And they have trouble hearing even if it's the same or different sounds. Now, I'm going to kind of get a little bit ahead of myself. This came straight out of Godot. This is how he devised it here. So word 1, you write down R or L. Word 2, you write down R or L. And then is it the same or different? Now, I didn't fully appreciate this when I was designing the task, but this completely screwed up the statistics. Because, for example, number 1, you've got an R or an L, an R or an L, and then the same or different. So that means you've got like 2 identification tasks, but only 1 perception task. So there were twice as many identification tasks as there were perception. And I think Godot, when Godot did this in 1971, he only had 8 participants. So he wasn't concerned about the statistical analysis. I mean, I don't think they even had like an SPSS, you know, all those statistics programs on computers that we use nowadays back in 1971. But like I ran all this through the statistics analyzer on SPSS, and it meant I couldn't compare the statistics directly, because for every 2 identification tasks, we only had 1 perception task. I guess in retrospect, the alternative would have been to just, I don't know, do all of this and then like do another different task where they had to listen to another whole recording, and then they had to mark kind of same or different, and you had to make sure that the same or different one was equal to this in length. Is that making sense? Okay, let me try and explain that again. The statistics got screwed up because there were 2 of these. Like if you have light, right, and they write like LR. So that's 2 identification tasks. But then the same or different was the same for both of these. So then this is only 1 perception task, which meant there were half as many as this, which caused trouble later when I tried to run the statistical analysis on it. All these things that you kind of don't see coming. Okay, then the phonotactics. Right, so I was just talking about this, right? The train versus tlane, right? The fact that there are some consonant combinations that are permissible in English and ones that aren't, and to design a task on that. So my advisor recommended to me that I just do the same thing with the phonotactics. You know, what sound is it? Is it same or different? Now I was thinking, every study ever done indicates that Japanese people cannot identify R and L above chance. They can't do it when it's single. They can't do it when it's a consonant cluster. So I thought, well, if we put in the phonotactics, we're not going to get anything interesting. It's just going to be like, okay, and the phonotactics weren't above chance. I mean, every other, they can't identify R and L above chance in any other context. So why would we expect it to be any different for the phonotactics? So I said, let's do a different task with that. Let's see if they can identify if it's a real or unreal word. Yeah, where is this here? Somewhere here. There's they listen to it and they just kind of check down, is it real or unreal? Sorry, here it is. So there are 2 words, and they have to put the X by the word that they think is the real English word. And if they don't know, they were just encouraged to take a guess at which word like sounds more like an English word. And I thought maybe we could get something interesting out of this. Like maybe they can't hear, they don't know what an R and an L is, but they've got some sort of through exposure or through their English studies or through whatever, they've developed some sort of sense about what English is supposed to sound like. And so like, oh, that doesn't sound like a natural English word. I can't put my finger on exactly why. Maybe they can't hear the difference between R and L, but they know it doesn't sound right. And I thought maybe we could get something interesting out of that. My advisor recommended against it. We talked about this, and in the end she let me do it my way. But she was right. And again, this was one of those things which I didn't realize until I collected all the data and I was doing the statistical analysis, but this screwed up the statistics because now I couldn't compare it with the other task. What I should have done is done the exact same task, and then I would have had two things which were statistically comparable. Now, like, not only was the number different, like there was, 10 here and 24 here, but the task was completely different. So you couldn't just run it through the statistical analysis and see which task they were doing better. The best you could do was compare percentages, which is not ideal for these quantitative papers when you're trying to present your numbers in terms of statistical analysis. So yeah, that was a stupid move on my part. What I should have done is I should have just kept the same task and then just kind of see what happened and just kind of sort through the data from there. Anyways, those are some statistical problems you don't see coming. So the results on this. Sorry, one more tangent. This is maybe something I should have mentioned earlier. I didn't describe the participants in Japan. So the participants in Australia, in Melbourne, were all international students. I think most of them there was in university. I think maybe there was one high schooler, I don't remember. In Japan, they were at an Eikaiwa school, which is an English conversation school, which I had been working at before I left Japan, and I had arranged with my buddy there to kind of help me collect the data. I had been forewarned about this before I went on the master's program. Somebody said, make sure you line up how you're going to collect your data before you start the master's program. So I made this agreement with them before I left for Australia. I said, I'm thinking I might do some sort of thesis that involves Japan somehow. Would you help me collect data? And he said, yeah, sure. So it was students, it was an English conversation school, Eikaiwa school, which in Japan means it's kind of mostly adult students or high school students who are taking private English classes. In either one-on-one tuition or kind of small groups, and they will come in for maybe 1 or 2 hours a week for kind of private English tuition. So this was the participants I had access to. It wasn't ideal because what would have been ideal is to get like normal Japanese people who weren't studying English. I mean, everyone studies English in Japan because it's in the public schools. But if you've been in Japan, you know how terrible their English education system is in the public schools. So for example, to get like a group of Japanese high school students who were studying English in high school, but not really studying English, like the high school English program in Japan is not very good. Or at least it wasn't very good 10 years ago when I was there. It's kind of all grammar, no speaking, no pronunciation. So, yeah, if I could have gotten access to the high school, that would have been ideal. Because the participants who were going to the English conversation school were not baseline Japanese. They were interested in studying English. They were paying money for private lessons. They were talking with a native speaker for a couple hours a week. I mean, they weren't living in a foreign country, but they weren't like, they were still getting a certain amount of exposure from a native speaker every week. Unfortunately, it's just hugely bureaucratic to do anything, any kind of data collection in the Japanese public schools. And I'm not entirely complaining about this because I think Japan is right to be protective of their students. But it is an issue if you're doing any of this kind of linguistic research. You just can't get access to the public schools. So the participants in Japan were studying English from a native speaker. It wasn't baseline, but whatever. Okay, so the results after I did the statistical analysis is, in terms of identifying what was L and what was R, there was no difference. There was a small difference, but it wasn't statistically significant. I think the group in Australia did maybe slightly better on the single consonants like R and L in isolation, right, light, but it wasn't statistically significant. The group in Japan, surprisingly, actually did better on the consonant clusters, things like glove, grove. Grove's not a word. Glass, grass. The group in Japan actually did better on that than the group in Australia. Again, it wasn't statistically significant. But it's surprising that, you know, the group living in Japan did better than the group actually living in Australia. Neither was statistically significant. So, like, for all intents and purposes, no difference. But the group in Australia did much better at perceiving the differences between sounds. Like, is it the same sound or different sounds? They did much better at that at a level that was statistically significant. And this was, I guess, the only interesting thing that came out of this whole data set I collected. Everything else is kind of uninteresting or kind of not statistically significant. So, what's going on here? I thought this was interesting. It looks like by living in Australia and kind of being exposed to English all around them, the Japanese people living there had their perception sharpened. They could recognize with greater accuracy the difference between R and L sounds that the group living in Japan could not. But they couldn't accurately place those sounds into what was an L and what was an R. And theorizing here, but the reason probably is when you're just perceiving the different sounds, that's simply like your auditory capabilities and your perception. So that can be kind of sharpened through exposure. But when you're saying, okay, this sound is an R sound, this sound is an L sound, then you've got to take those sounds you've identified and map them on to pre-existing linguistic categories. And that requires kind of you learning the system that's outside of yourself. You learning what an R sounds like, learning what an L sounds like. So their perception was getting sharpened, but nobody was teaching them, okay, this is what an L sounds like. So that, you know, that sound that you realize is different than that other sound, one of them is an L and one of them was an R. No one was teaching them which sounds matched up to which consonants. So I said perhaps, you've got to make your thesis sound like you discovered something significant. So I said perhaps this is an area for teachers to develop, you know. If you got these Japanese students who are studying abroad, so like you're teaching at a ESL program in Australia or an ESL program in America or in England or something where these Japanese students have been living abroad, you can expect their perception to have been sharpened by the exposure, but you need to work with them on the identification. And hopefully the identification should be easier now that their perception is sharpened. It's one of those things. After kind of spending so long working on this stupid thing, I thought that was quite interesting when I kind of discovered that, and nobody else cared. I remember I was riding on the bus with one of my classmates, and I was explaining it to her, and I was kind of so excited about it, and she just didn't care. And it's, yeah, to be fair, I don't think I would care myself if I hadn't been the one researching it. But, you know, even if the topic is not inherently interesting, you just can't help but get invested in it when you spend kind of months working on it. The other stuff, I don't even remember. What did I find out about Phonotactics? I think the groups in Melbourne kind of slightly better identified the real and unreal words than the group in Japan. But because I had made that stupid decision to do different tasks, I couldn't compare it to the rest of the data. Yeah, there was other stuff. I did analysis about which consonant clusters got identified better by different groups. None of the rest of that was interesting. That was the main kind of takeaway for me. Okay, so thank you for indulging me. I'm just gonna finish off here. That's the end.